today we're going to talk about the most exciting and fun and definitely not frustrating process of NEPA. It does not have to be a very difficult process, but my job and the job of my coworkers, our small but mighty EHP team, is to help grantees through the environmental compliance process so that it can go quickly, we can protect the environment, and get the grant dollars out the door, get the fiber deployed. So we'll see what we can go through. I don't have a whole lot of time, but so it's going to be a lot of information. And of course, any questions at the end if we have time, and otherwise I'll be around for the rest of the afternoon in case anyone wants to talk about their project specifically. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry, the green one? Oh, okay. Oh, wait. Thank you. A quick disclaimer that, of course, anything I say or do here cannot be held against me, and always refer to your NOFO guidance that's online. Again, I'll do my best to answer questions, but, gotta just make sure that, don't get myself in trouble. More trouble than I already am as someone who does NEPA. Just a quick agenda. Going to kind of just go through what NEPA is, NHPA, talk a little bit about project descriptions, and of course, EHP responsibilities. And then probably most important is what's new at NTIA. There's been quite a few developments over the last few weeks, and so I'm going to go over those, and we'll see how that goes as well. All right, so NEPA and NHPA overview. There we go. Okay, so what is NEPA? NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is an umbrella law that provides a framework for how all environmental, historic, and cultural laws can be evaluated and establishes environmental protection as federal policy. NEPA, as well as the National Historic Preservation Act, requires that federal agencies take a hard look at what the impacts to resources are going to be before they move forward with an action. So NEPA applies to all projects that have some sort of federal nexus. So in the case of these broadband grants, the broadband grants are federal dollars that are being used, and so that's where the federal nexus comes in, making NEPA applicable to a project. There's a whole bunch of environmental laws and executive orders which fall under NEPA. So for example, you have Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, and ultimately NEPA is really a process for how all of these different environmental resources are going to be evaluated, and all the different laws that go into making sure that compliance is actually occurring. One of the biggest key takeaways is that a project cannot begin construction, installation, deployment until the NEPA process is complete. So please don't do that. Just make sure that we're all good before you start putting shovels in the ground. And one of the other big things is that NEPA does not mean that there cannot be any environmental impacts. And I think that's a really common misconception. NEPA just says that the environmental impacts for a project need to be disclosed, again, so that the federal agency has information for being able to make a decision and see if there's any minimization, mitigation, or avoidance measures that can be taken to help protect the environmental resources. I tend to think of it as more of a sustainable development type of situation where we all need power, electricity, we need broadband. There are going to be impacts to the environment, but there is a way to ensure that they are as minimal as possible so that those resources can continue to be enjoyed. Okay, let me move on here. Okay, so the levels of NEPA review, which again, for those of you having been sort of familiar with the NEPA process, this is all going to look familiar. We have CADXs, we have environmental assessments, and then environmental impact statements. The categorical exclusions are really the simplest form of NEPA that a project can fall under. And I will say, I'm going to talk about this later, but for those of you who know, there are a bunch of new CADXs that just got published, so we're going to talk about those at the end. The process for a categorical exclusion is providing documentation for a project where, one, we actually have a category for a project, but also being able to show that there are no extraordinary circumstances from project impacts. And that just really means having some sort of adverse impact to a sensitive resource. One of the other biggest misconceptions is that documentation for categorical exclusions is required. So we do have some categorical exclusions where there's no ground disturbance, and that's a little bit more of a simple process. But say you're going to be putting in new buried fiber or putting in new towers, documentation is still required, and it really just goes through the main resources for environmental and historic preservation, where you're looking at wetlands, floodplains, threatened and endangered species, and being able to analyze what those impacts are. So it's a pretty straightforward process. And again, anyone who has questions later, happy to talk about that. The next level of NEPA documentation is going to be an environmental assessment. And that's a document just has a little bit more comprehensive information. It does include an alternative section, cumulative impact section, and it also requires that there's a 30-day public comment period for that environmental assessment, which just means that it gets published on the Broadband USA website, and anyone is allowed to comment on the project, whether they are in support of or have concerns about certain resources. Lastly, we have an environmental impact statement, which we have not had so far. In my previous life at one of my previous agencies, it was pretty much all environmental impact statements. And again, it's just a little bit of a different process, but something to get through. And again, it's very unlikely that an EIS is going to be required for a project. All right, so everyone's favorite question, which no one ever likes my answer, is how long does the environmental process take? And my answer is, it depends. It depends on many, many things. But I am just going to, again, go over some of the general timeframes for a project just based on, the years of going through these processes. So for a categorical exclusion, in order to get through the NEPA process, it typically takes somewhere between 3 to 6 months. It can take a little bit less time, it can take a little bit longer, but generally from the time the documentation is being drafted and getting to a NEPA determination memo, usually in that time frame. For an environmental assessment, it usually takes 6 to 12 months. Again, it's a document that has more comprehensive information, and again, it has that 30-day public comment period. So, but again, depending on what the project is and what the project scope is, it can take a little bit less time. It's not as often that it ends up taking longer than a year. And then, of course, for what I hope doesn't happen, is an environmental impact statement, which can take 12 to 24 months. Sorry, too many things here. All right, so section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. I know we get a lot of questions about this, and it's a process that can sometimes take a little bit more time just because of consultation. However, it again doesn't need to be a very lengthy process, and the EPOs, the environmental program officers, again, we're here to help you through the process and make sure that the process is being done as efficiently as possible. So section 106, it essentially requires federal agencies to consider the effects of a project on historic properties and any undertakings that are having federal funding associated with it. Section 106, it's governed by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and really what it involves is either consultation with the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, or the TIPO, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. So for projects that are on tribal land where the tribe has a TIPO, you can just consult with the TIPO to go through the Section 106 process. For projects that are for projects that are on tribal land where the tribe does not have a federally recognized TIPO, then consultation with the SHPO would be necessary. And for projects that are off tribal land, that's a little bit of a different situation where we actually use FCC's Tower Construction Notification System, which allows us to get information about other tribes who have historical or cultural significance or interest in the project area. All right, so what exactly is the Section 106 process? There's a few different steps, and I'll go through these. The first thing is really identifying who needs to be consulted with for the project. So again, do you need to talk to a THPO? Do you need to talk to a SHPO? Are there other tribes who maybe need to be notified about the project? And next, of course, you're going to be looking at identifying whether there are any historical properties that might be affected by a project. And most of the time, this is going to include buildings or structures that are over the age of 50 years, but it also includes historical districts, if there's any known cultural sites, and locations of cultural or historical significance. And again, just going back to projects that are on tribal lands, you know, tribes, they know their land, you know where the resources are, if there's any sacred sites or sites that are of particular interest or you want to be protected, it's really important that the TIPO, or if the tribe has a cultural resources manager, that those folks are really involved in the process so that those resources can be identified and then hopefully avoided, or that there can be minimization or mitigation measures to protect those resources. And I always like to say, we can't do anything about a problem that we don't know about. So it's really important to get this information up front and as soon as possible so that all of these items can be discussed if there's route variations, and take all of this into account with actually figuring out where the project is going to go and being able to avoid resources. All right, so there's numerous tools to help with Section 106. I'm not going to go over all of these now. These are actually links. Probably the biggest thing, where again, it's one of the new developments I'm going to talk about, is that there's a revised ACHP program comment. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, but there's just some good resources for everybody. All right, so the EHP preservation requirements. The most important thing, again, another key takeaway here, is being able to provide your EPO with a very detailed project description in terms of what the project scope is, what you're planning on doing, because again, it allows us to figure out what level of NEPA documentation is going to be required for your project. And that's what really gets the ball rolling in terms of figuring out what resources need to be identified, getting that documentation prepared, and then ultimately sent to NTIA for review. There are some projects, again, where there is no ground disturbance, whether it's buying laptops or funding an IT position or installation on an existing tower or on existing homes. And in that cases, sometimes a full set of environmental documentation is actually not required. So I just want to let you guys know about that too. And again, talking to your EPO is going to be the most helpful, but there's not a lot we can do until we actually get that very detailed project description about, again, where these resources are actually going to be deployed. One of the other things, we highly recommend that environmental consultants are brought on board to help prepare this environmental documentation. So, if there's not in-house staff who has the knowledge about NEPA and the different environmental laws and requirements, it's not required, but again, we strongly recommend that. It can help the process go through a lot more quickly, because these consultants and these experts, they understand NEPA, they know what's required, and they also know where to find that information, so that, again, it just helps things go more quickly. And again, just to reiterate, no construction or installation until EHP is complete. I don't think I can say that enough, actually. You'd be surprised. But again, that process does not need to be completed in the pre-award process. That would only need to be completed post-award, once the award's actually received. And again, every project will have an EPO assigned to them. So as soon as that happens, you want to make sure you get in touch with the EPO, again, to figure out exactly what needs to happen and get that process moving forward. All right, so a little bit more about project descriptions, because I like to harp on this one because it's so important. So here's just some general information about what should be included, but when I talk about the project scope, there's, of course, lots and lots of projects, and we have a lot of things coming across our desk, and we don't always have a lot of background information about a project before we're asked to provide guidance for what's going to be required for NEPA. So, for example, project description. Are you going to be proposing new poles? Is it going to be aerial fiber? Is it going to be buried fiber? Where is all this going to be placed? Are there, fiber huts? Are there any interconnection points? These are the things that we need to know in order to be able to, again, provide you with what level of NEPA documentation is going to be required for the project. Oh yes, again, I don't know what I would do without. I don't know about anybody else, but I always need notes. I need to write things down, otherwise I'm going to forget them. But so one of the other things that we commonly see is missing is supporting documentation for information about environmental resources. And again, I would love to take everyone's word for it that there's no wetlands or there's no T&E, and I would love to have that trust, but legally that could get me in a lot of trouble. So we really need to have that supporting documentation for what resources are there, what resources would be impacted. And again, this is all information that it's actually available online, and there are lots of resources out there to help find this information. But it's something that, we need to make sure that we have citations and references for the information that's provided. Right. More project description. Actually, I think I covered most of this, but let me make sure. Yes. So again, it's the consultation with other agencies, threatened and endangered species, being able to look at an IPAC report, wetlands, looking at national wetland inventory maps, or floodplains to see if your project is located in a floodplain area and if that could potentially be an issue. So these are, again, all things that are really helpful for the EPO to help determine what level of NEPA documentation is going to be required. Right, so EHP responsibilities, who's responsible for what? Unfortunately, NTIA is not responsible for everything, and there's a lot of information that the grantees need to provide to us. So I'll just go over that a little bit. So again, NTIA, it's the Environmental Program Officer who will determine what level of NEPA documentation is going to be required for your project, and making sure that that information that's provided is sufficient and it's legally justifiable. Again, having those supporting documentations, site references. Back up. Once we determine what level of NEPA documentation is going to be required for your project, we will provide you with guidance documents and templates for whichever level of NEPA documentation is going to be required, and also provide you with examples so you can get a better sense of what it is that we're looking for and how the information is presented. And of course, through the life of the project and getting through the NEPA process, your EPO is there to provide technical assistance to you to help you or consultants figure out what information needs to be provided, if you're having any issues with an agency, or whether certain information needs to be provided. That's what we're there for. And for, all of our projects, we have meetings that are set up on a regular basis just to touch points. So I don't want anyone to feel like you're going to be going through this process alone and we're just going to say, here's a guidance document, good luck, figure it out. We're going to be there to help you through all of this. That is literally our job. Let's see what else here. Okay, so on the grantee side, The grantees are responsible for actually gathering and preparing the documentation for NEPA. So that means if it's a categorical exclusion, putting the information together in a document. I like to think of it as more of an environmental report. And again, for an environmental assessment, it would be the grantee, or again, getting help from consultants who are actually drafting this documentation and putting it together to provide that to NTIA for review. One of the other things that is typically missing, especially early on in the process, is actually accounting for the budget for preparing EHP information and then also the timeline for completing NEPA. So again, probably one of the biggest takeaways is NEPA applies. We're all going to have to go through the process and make sure that those items are accounted for when you're looking at, okay, we got an award, this is when we want to start construction, we need to go through this NEPA process, and this is about how long it's going to take. All right, there's a lot on this slide here with consultations and permitting, and it really just has a list of the different federal, state, and local permits that can possibly apply for a project that you're working on. And again, so I would say for federal authorization, some of the big ones, Section 7 of the ESA, Endangered Species. Of course, you're going to have Section 106 and complying, for cultural resources and historic properties, and 404 and 401 of the Clean Water Act, and working with the Corps. So again, depends on what type of project scope you have, where it's actually being deployed, what's involved. And again, the EPO is there to help you figure out exactly what needs to be done and help you along the way to work through this process. All right, so what's new at NTIA? Everyone's, I know you, back. Okay, sorry. I think I was hoping everyone is sitting on the edge of their seats to find out what's new at NTIA, but thank you for that. So one of the first things is the availability of a new public mapping tool. And the goal of this tool is to allow anybody, it's public facing, allow anybody to be able to pull up this map, look at where they're potentially putting their project site or deployment locations, and being able to look at the different resources that are present in that project area. So, and there's different layers you can use. You can look at wetlands, floodplains, T&E, for example. This tool just came out. There's a link to it. You can find it on the Broadband USA website. And there's also, along with that, a tutorial video that helps show how to use it, which admittedly, I've not watched that video yet, but I have heard very positive feedback that it's really, really helpful. And again, because looking at the planning process really early to help figure out where your project is going so that you can avoid any sensitive resources if possible. One of the best things about broadband is that it is extremely flexible in terms of placement. So it's actually very easy to say you're going to be putting in a fiber route, a buried fiber route, and maybe instead of going through some critical habitat for an endangered species or going directly through a huge wetland complex, you can actually just shift the route a little bit and be completely able to avoid those sensitive resources, which again allows you to get through the environmental review process more quickly. The second, which I mentioned earlier, is the revised program comment from ACHP. I'm also still learning about this one, and I would never claim to be an expert in this one. So if anyone has more questions about this, I'm happy to also connect you with some other of my colleagues who know much more about this one. But it sounds like it's gonna be pretty great, but it basically allows a more streamlined process to occur on all lands, not just federal lands. Previously, it was just federal lands. Now it can apply everywhere. It's not going to be applicable on tribal land unless the tribe explicitly agrees to have this process occur. So I just want to make that very, very clear. And again, so when we're looking at Section 106 and different SHPOs, every state is a little bit different, and the goal is to really have that streamlined process for exactly what information is required and be able to have people be more prepared for providing that information, again, so you can ultimately get through the Section 106 process more quickly. So this is not something that's required. It is optional on tribal land. So again, just want to make sure that that's clear. And okay, lastly, I think this is the most exciting, and I know you've all been really waiting for this one. NTIA has a whole bunch of new categorical exclusions that we can use, and these just came out. I'm, again, also still reading through all of them, but it's really, really exciting. Getting these new categorical exclusions approved has actually been, I think, an almost 3-year process. So it has been going on for a long time, and working with the Council on Environmental Quality to approve these. So NTIA previously only had 11 categorical exclusions, which it's really not a lot. Now we have 30 new NTIA categorical exclusions, and we also have 6 categorical exclusions which were adopted from FirstNet. And really, this is just going to allow us to have more latitude with being able to have a project fall under a CADX versus needing to go through the environmental assessment process. Because again, maybe an environmental assessment, a project that would be an environmental assessment, really was not going to have a whole lot of different impacts. However, we didn't have a categorical exclusion for which that project could fit. So we would have to go the route of the environmental, well, pun intended, route of the environmental assessment. So now hopefully we can go through the projects a little bit more quickly. We can have more CADXs. It just allows more flexibility. And again, there's also a guidance document that was also published recently that is on the Broadband USA website. It is, if you go to the Broadband USA website and you go to technical assistance, and then on the left side of the page, there's a section for permitting and environmental and historic preservation. You can click on that. And I believe the document is all the way at the bottom, and it goes through the list of all of the new CADXs, but also goes through some, again, just additional guidance information. So, and again, just to be clear, we are still keeping the Department of Commerce original 11 CADXs. So we technically have 47 now. So that is a huge accomplishment. And of course, my team lead, Amanda Pereira, if any of you are familiar with her, she is amazing, and she worked really, really hard. So we're all very, very thankful for her and hope that everyone is excited as we are. So, and with that, I don't know if we have time for questions. I know we're behind. Okay, if anyone has questions, I will be sitting at my little table out there. I'll be there for the rest of the afternoon. And what? Oh, yes. Yeah. So thank you again, everybody, for your time. I really, really appreciate it.